Hello, hello, welcome, please come in. The magic only runs are completed, and we arrive, as always, at our summary video. Here I will go through the runs, rate them on an assortment of categories, and really just go over what we just went through together. As usual, there is a card in the corner to the playlist of prior videos, if you haven't seen them. I do recommend watching them first, and not just for my view count, but also understanding what happened in the runs will contextualize everything I'm about to say. But preamble is done, let's dive in. And the first question I must answer is why I chose the games I chose. Because I chose some interesting titles and excluded others. And I pushed off explaining myself so I could do so in the context of this summary video. And to help me in doing so, we pop into good old Tier Maker. My first category of excluded games were 11 and 14, because they are MMOs, which falls well outside the context of what I normally cover on this channel, and wouldn't really have worked for a Magic-only run anyway, both because they are mechanically very distinct from other Final Fantasies, but also because beating an MMO is a bit more nebulous and would likely take way too long. Listen, I put out at least one video a week. I do not have time to play through an MMO for a single video. I don't even have as much time as I'd like to play games outside of what I record for the channel. I have to be time efficient, is what I'm getting at. Next category are games with job class systems, which includes FF1, FF3, FF5, and FF12. While these games could be viable for this challenge, they feel like they already have a built-in system for other challenges based around class use and acquisition. And these games also tend not to have set magic commands, rather giving access to a variety of different magic commands depending on the job. And to be frank, I've already done 2 full series of class-based challenges in these games, and 2 one-offs, and I have set myself to doing many more. These games do not need any more spotlight on the channel than they are already pretty consistently getting. Next up are the games that have set party composition. This includes FF4, FF9, and FF10. These are games where you have set parties that rotate around and where each character fills a specific, limited role. And yes, I know technically 10 has huge versatility with the sphere grid, but everyone is going to have a set class in that game until the end of the game unless you really break the system. These games are excluded because having specific characters have specific character abilities, which may or may not qualify as magic, this would limit what characters were useful or usable, particularly in sections where that character must be in the party. While that is perfectly valid as a challenge run, it was outside the scope of what I wanted for this challenge run series. And the next category to be removed from consideration are the games with what I'll call weird combat systems. This includes Final Fantasy XIII, 15, and 16. These games are technically Final Fantasy games, but their mechanics are so different as to be functionally outside the scope of what I'm talking about here. While I'm sure these games could be included in a challenge run series, they don't really work with Magic only because of how different the games work compared to prior games. FF16 doesn't really have commands or magic at all, depending on how you define it. FF15 has little orbs that explode that are limited by stock and not that fun. And I don't want to play Final Fantasy XIII again. This left me with 4 main-numbered Final Fantasy games in the running: 2, 6, 7, and 8. And that seemed like a good number of games for a series, so I didn't really have to cull them down any further. In truth, I was actually going to exclude 7, just because I tried to choose a diverse array of titles, and including 7 meant doing 6, 7, and 8 right in a row. It was only after completing the video on 6 that I decided 7 should in fact be included. And I'm very glad I did, for reasons I'll cover later. But yes, that is why these games were chosen, and not others. I'm sure there will be many opinions that you are welcome to leave in the comments. But it is time to move on. Onward to our first category of comparison, the difficulty of the run. How difficult were these runs to do? Which is always interesting to compare. Sometimes the games fall very much in line with what I expected, and sometimes I am very surprised by how easy or difficult a run is. But this series may have the widest disparity in difficulty of any series I've ever done. From the sarcastically easy to very challenging to get through, it's really been a wild ride. And to get into the ride, let's start it off. And we start at the beginning with Final Fantasy II. And this game comfortably slides into second place. I think this was the second most difficult of the runs to complete. It's pretty close with the game that took third place, but I do think FF2 just edges it out to hit the second place mark. FF2's leveling and progression system is very interesting. You level up stats, weapons, and magic as you use it. This really gives you a lot of freedom to build your characters however you want. However, it suffers in that things just level too slowly. I can't imagine why characters in this game have 16 magic slots. Who would ever try to level up 16 different spells on one character? Even getting a single spell to endgame viability, around level 10, takes a very long time. And considering that they actually max out at 16, yeah, no. Even in this run, where I could do nothing but use magic in combat, I still only had a max spell level at level 12, I think? But specifically on the difficulty front, there were a good number of bosses that proved to be oddly challenging. I specifically am thinking about Chimera, Bighorns, and the Emperor. While the game wasn't always difficult, it did do a good job of maintaining a consistent difficulty throughout. And while magic is good, and MP is basically never an issue, magic isn't overpowered by any degree. In fact, physical attacks are probably better in many cases for damage. The game also has a frankly absurd number of buffing spells. I don't even know what all these do. But it speaks to the game's difficulty that the spell list can have so many buffs I want to activate, and they actually feel mostly useful. Final Fantasy I. But FF2 really does manage to be quite challenging in places, and while the spell variety helps overcome these challenges, it doesn't make them irrelevant. Next up is FF6. This game came close to matching FF2 in difficulty. I changed my mind several times when deciding which of these games would be third and which would be second, because they are very similar in their difficulty, with FF6 also having particular bosses that were a lot more difficult than I would have expected. But that is also why FF6 ended up being placed in third rather than second, because a good difficulty curve works in a particular way, getting more difficult as the game progresses, and FF6 utterly fails to do that. The game starts off pretty challenging, but I can't help but notice that most of that difficulty is because the game is functionally a solo character run for the first third. Because of how late you can start teaching characters magic via Magicite, you are limited to using Celes and Terra exclusively in combat, ignoring the sections of the game where neither of these characters are present. And yeah, it is difficult when you're doing a magic-only and solo character run simultaneously. But then you get Magicite. Then everyone can learn magic, and yes, Terra and Celes are great characters to have in the party, but it is very obvious in the difficulty when you go from 1, or briefly 2, to a full party of characters all wielding magic. And then you get Tier 3 magic, then you get Ultima, and the difficulty of the game completely collapses in the final third. Yeah, the strong magic is expensive to cast, but that means nothing when literally every character in your party can have Osmos. I really do not understand why Osmos works the way it does. Drains MP from the target equal to lost MP, and then restores it to you? That is absurd. That makes the high MP cost of Ultima a minor inconvenience at worst. And it's not like Ultima is hard to get. As soon as you get Lockback in the party, you just chat with the blacksmith and he gives it to you basically for nothing. Especially in a magic-only run where the other option, a sword, is completely worthless. I mean, it's no more broken than Knights of the Round in FF7, but at least Knights of the Round takes a lot of effort to get. Ultima is just right there. So yeah, I ultimately decided FF6 would be placed below FF2 in the difficulty ranking, because they have very similar, but very opposite, difficulty curves. And one of those difficulty curves is set up in the correct direction a difficult curve should be. And next is FF7, which gets to slide comfortably into first place, which isn't really surprising, as anyone who has seen the run may understand that this game is actually the only one of the 3 games that I would actually consider difficult. While FF2 had some challenges, FF7 was a bit of a struggle the whole way. Not necessarily in a bad way, though also not necessarily in a good way. Looking at you, Demon Gate. It's more that this game had one ongoing issue throughout that always had to be at the forefront of my planning. MP. Unlike FF2, where the MP costs are so low as to be irrelevant, and FF6, where Osmos exists, FF7 made MP the big issue of the entire run. Without items to restore MP in combat, MP cost and max MP were always an issue. From the very first battle, where I had to reset and use a tent, to the final fight, where MP-absorbing Ultima was barely enough to keep my MP up, this was an ever-present concern. There were many times where the issue wasn't damage, or HP, or healing, but just needing to do something to make sure I had the MP to cast my spells. But even setting MP aside for a moment, there were other areas of difficulties that I had to consider. Mostly that spells don't deal very much damage in FF7, which is honestly not something I was expecting. I normally use physical attacks, limit breaks, enemy skills, and summons pretty liberally in combat, and normal spells are generally weaker than any of these. Even Ultima, the strongest spell in the game, was only dealing 5,000 damage, which isn't nothing, but considering I have plus 10 earrings and 2 magic plus materia boosting my magic stat, that's actually really bad. And that compounded with it also costing more MP than it ever has. And maybe more than it ever does in future games. And while MP absorb is great, it absorbs MP relative to damage dealt, which isn't great. I had to timely use Ultima in the Bizarro Sephiroth fight only once his head regenerates, specifically so I could deal more damage and keep my MP high. And then there are all the normal magic-only problems. Reviving dead characters, curing statuses. In FF6, every character could learn every spell, but in FF7 I was limited by the materia I had in my inventory, and the materia slots I had on my equipment. And that's before factoring in support materia and independent materia. Every materia slot was precious, and everyone I equipped had to be carefully considered. Careful about what was and wasn't important to ensure I had the magic I would need to beat the bosses. So there were a variety of factors. A perfect storm of factors, making FF7 the hardest of these runs to complete. And FF8, which gets to be dropped in last place without any hesitation. I knew halfway through the run that there was basically no chance that this game would manage to eke out anything better than easiest in the series. This game is just balanced so badly in so many fundamental ways. And same disclaimer as the video itself, but I'm going to be a little critical of FF8, despite enjoying the game very much. This game is just a mess. Bosses leveling up or down to your level is a fine idea in theory, but this disincentivizes leveling and progression, which by itself is not great for an RPG, but it also fails when it disincentivizes leveling so hard, the game is actually easier if you don't level up. That's not how that should work. I mean, I had to intentionally level up my character to reach the boss's max levels, specifically in the hope that it would make the game be more difficult. And it worked. Kind of. I mean, a few bosses actually were spicy. I even died once. But dying once, by accident, is not enough to bring this any further up when the rest of the fights were almost comically easy. I can't imagine what the game would have looked like if I just kept going and not bothered to ever gain any levels. Just getting access to HP Junction and an easy source of Curaga at the start of the game breaks the combat design, and it's not even work to do. Just buy some tents, convert to Curagas. Whoops, game broken. I can appreciate what they were aiming for with this design, but wow, it does not work at all. And while I wasn't expecting FF8 to be difficult, in fact I was expecting it to be easy, I wasn't expecting it to be so easy that I had to actively work to make the game more difficult. Oh FF8, I do like you, but if my personal life is any indication, I have terrible taste. And that is difficulty all wrapped up. A nice spread from difficult and required careful planning all the way to had to actively make the challenge more difficult. But now it's time for the recommended section. In what order would I recommend these challenge runs? Which is always my favorite part, just digging through the games and deciding whether I would recommend them to a random person on the street. Perhaps while shouting obscenities, who can say? I'm not that interested in preamble, so let's dive in. And we start with Final Fantasy II, which is the oldest of the games I played in the series. Obviously, it is also the first. This means it suffers many of the same kind of issues FF1 suffers, in that it is an early game in a series that would continue to iterate and improve over the coming games. Which is why I must place FF2, Magic Only, in third on my recommended list. And it more or less comes down to the fundamental failures of the game's progression system. As I said in the video, very bold to implement this system of stat improvement in an NES game, but it does feel like it was implemented in an NES game. And that does sound harsh, because it is, but I will say just casually playing through the game, not really engaging with the system, mostly works. But when you start to really dig into it, either because you have to, because you're doing an analytic video, or because you're doing a challenge run that requires some planning and foresight, you start to see the problems. And FF2 has issues aplenty. Issue 1, healing status effects, is a mess. Asuna and Basuna only heal certain status effects depending on how much you've leveled the spell, which means it's basically impossible to level organically through play, because the spells are basically worthless most of the time until you already have leveled them up. Then we get to support spells, which have a similar problem, having effects strongly determined by their level to determine their efficacy, and while I mentioned it in the difficulty section, it deserves repeating. Spells level so slowly. Unreasonably slowly. How in the world would you level any spell to max, let alone 16? And then there are weird systems like magic interference, which only really hinder status effects, are never explained, and just make everything more complicated. And this also means it's basically impossible to know if you were overleveled, underleveled, or on track. I recall the GBA game guide for FF2 gives recommended HP totals for certain areas, probably because that was the cleanest shorthand for level they could possibly use. Now, I'm not saying FF2's progression ruins the game. It doesn't, but it does try. Playing this game in a more casual playthrough, it will probably work out just fine, but when you're being mindful of how you are playing and using an unorthodox playstyle, it falls apart. Not the most disaster, as evidenced by being a 3rd place, but it is pretty rough. Next up is FF6, which will earn the 2nd slot on this recommendation listing. And there's a lot of reasons for that. A lot of things to like about it. First is the Magicite system mostly works. Admittedly, you do get Magicite later in the playthrough than I'd have liked. I think that was why I initially bounced off this game on my first playthrough attempt many years ago. But at least the delay in Magicite acquisition feels narratively justified rather than feeling arbitrary. While I did a lot of grinding in this playthrough to get access to magic, that is a flaw in the challenge rather than the game itself. I suspect the actual design expects you to learn magic more through normal story progression rather than dedicated grinding, although it also incentivizes you to use 12 different characters, so maybe not. I think there are 2 main reasons that FF6 falls short of 1st place. First is the amount of time you can't actually do the challenge. While Celes and Terra can both use magic, they are not in your party for decent chunks of the first third of the game. And during these sections, you just have no one that can use magic at all, making the game challenge moot. The other main issue, as hinted at during the difficulty section, is the complete collapse of the difficulty the game was attempting to maintain at the end of the run. Once you get tier 3 spells in Ultima, the game is no longer challenging, even a little bit. I noticed this most keenly during the final fights with Kefka, which should, in theory, be the hardest part of the run, but it just wasn't. Ultima is just oppressively strong in this game, rendering every boss after getting the spell completely trivial. And okay, it costs a lot of MP, but Osmos exists. Who cares how much it costs to cast, when the cost doesn't matter? And the fact that every character can learn every spell with essentially no cost means having every character know Ultima, no Osmos, no Curaga, no full life. It's trivial. The first 2/3 of this game are good and interesting and heartily recommended. The last third is barely worth the time it takes to complete, because if you made it that far, completing the challenge is basically a foregone conclusion. So it's not that I wouldn't recommend it, it comes in 2nd place for a reason. It's just that recommendation comes with some caveats. And then there was FF7, which earns the top spot. I'm sure no one will be mad about this placement. Surely not. It's just that FF7 does so much right in this challenge, it has to rise above its peers and be placed at the top. And there is a lot of reasons why. Setting aside the Demon Gate that stole 2 hours of my life, this challenge stays interesting and difficult throughout. It may have earned the top spot in difficulty for the consistent complication of MP management, but that actually does a lot to ground this challenge. And of the magic systems in the 4 games I played, I think Materia is the most interesting and most balanced. First, it avoids FF6 issues of being 1, available immediately at the start of the game, because it isn't so tied into the narrative as to require delay, and 2, it has a cost to it. In FF6, any character can learn any spell through Magicite, and frankly, every character you use should learn every spell through Magicite. Materia solves this issue by having materia slots be a limited resource. Yes, I could have a mastered copy of every magic materia in the game in my inventory. But even if I do take the unreasonable amount of time to get that, every character has a max of 8 slots on their weapon and 8 slots on their armor. And I also have to balance that with the essential support and independent materia that can make a character actually viable in endgame battles. This means there is a cost, both to improve materia and to equip it, so magic is doubly not free in the same way it is in FF6. And yes, I'm comparing FF7 mostly to FF6 to justify its top slot, but that is mostly because FF2 and FF8 are very different systems that have more conspicuous issues. And another reason that the FF7 magic-only run earns the top spot is because of what it brings out in a playthrough. Regular attacks, limit breaks, summons, these are overwhelmingly powerful options in a regular playthrough, which can make using regular magic feel not worth the MP. So, in addition to all the things the materia system does right, a magic-only challenge run also incentivizes you to use magic that wouldn't normally be optimal in a standard playthrough. I mean, Ultima is the strongest magic in the game, but if you include summons, it's now 4th? Oh, actually, Flare is stronger? So 5th, and Flare is 3rd, I think? I can't find a table for this. Short version, summons are so much stronger than magic, and a single enemy skill materia can eclipse all the utility and effects you would ever need. So Magic-only FF7 is the most interesting of these challenges, but it is also the biggest improvement over a base playthrough of the game in question. Final Fantasy VIII goes last. I'd love to place it higher because I do like Final Fantasy VIII, but my goodness, this game is a disaster. I had always known how broken this game could be if you tried to break it, but I don't think I ever realized how broken it was just doing anything at all. It really tries to expand on the magic systems of prior games, and expanding that to be a holistic part of the game's mechanics. And it does succeed at that, but it never really grapples with the issue of whether that is a good thing. Spoiler, it is not. The game fails on so many levels. The game's omnipresent level scaling means that not only do you not feel stronger as you level, you actually feel weaker, because you are. Leveling up is only a downgrade, unless you equip all the bonus passives that you can only access near the end of the game, which means you are doing everything you can to break a game that's already broken. Then there is the fundamental flaw in junctioning magic to stats, which is that you now don't want to, and shouldn't, actually use that magic. Ever, because every time you do, you make yourself weaker. During the run, there was a period where my best magic spell was triple, but I also needed to cast triple every combat, creating a weird dichotomy between effectiveness and the junction. And rather than feel like an interesting choice between the usability of the spell and the effects it has while junctioned, it just feels like you have to hamstring yourself to cast magic. You know, the main aspect of this game's whole mechanic. Anytime I criticize an aspect of a game, I have to think, how could this be improved? What could make FF5 Red Mage good? How can Time Mage be a well-designed class when so many statuses are too powerful to be allowed to be deployed against bosses? But by the virtue of how holistic FF8's magic system is, fixing it is basically impossible. The system is bad on a fundamental level. It simply doesn't work to achieve the results it is intended for. I don't even know how this system ever could. It's just a mess. And that is it. We've gone through the games, compared their difficulty, compared whether I'd recommend magic-only challenge runs, explained why the games that were excluded, and said a lot of very mean things about a game I do genuinely enjoy despite its many flaws. So yeah, that's it. Another series done, another set of runs completed. I did want to shout out that I do now have a Patreon, linked in the description. I spend a lot of time making these videos, so if you enjoyed the video, want to support the channel, and are financially stable enough to do so, that exists. No pressure though, this channel is free to enjoy for everyone and will remain that way. For now, if you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. If you'd like to see more of this, feel free to subscribe. Hey, maybe leave a comment if you have something you'd like to say. But whatever you decide to do, have a safe trip home.